humble and kind.
Yeah.
Okay, we are done now. Thank you. Always stay humble and kind. I mean, so beautiful. It's my pleasure to welcome Reverend Andy Torkelson again from Chico. We just so appreciate you coming in. So let's go ahead.
Let me turn myself on. How's that?
Yes.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, I want to thank you so much for having me here today. I love this little center and its history, and it's always so kind to have you invite me. So thank you so much. I just want to say, I wanted to just say something about Rex really quickly. Rex to me had the energy of an old, what we used to call a gentleman. And I always loved that about him. And whenever I would come here, he would always, ask about me, ask how I was doing, and things like that. Hold on 1 second. And so I just, he was one of those people who had just such an interesting look about him, kind of a chiseled, weathered, in a good way look. And I just, his face is just right here with me, so. I just wanted to say that to you guys, and ever since I heard about his moving on, I thought about him a lot lately, and so my thoughts have really been like that. So it's interesting. I'm really super open to, and it actually is what I want to talk about today. And I don't believe in any accidents. I believe in synchronicities, and so it's really interesting. And whenever I have a topic nailed down, and when you speak, you kind of put it together. You have something in your mind. You come up with a title. You open up to what you feel you're being led to do, and then you kind of. This title's been with me for a couple of weeks because of some reasons that'll kind of unfold in a little bit. And so then you lay out the notes, and you think about it. And I drive here, and I'm running it through my head, and I journal about it, and I have all these rituals around speaking. And then there's this point where you have to just let go and have something come in. And so something just came in that you guys didn't realize, just kind of walked through the door. And so I was like, I'm not going to ignore this. And so my wife, Judy, she passed away a year ago, May 16th. And so I just went through an anniversary of that. And Judy and I, she's actually the one who got me involved in metaphysics and everything. And I just, that's a whole story that I'm not going to get into, but and we just had this really wonderful relationship. And through some of my work time when she and I were together, sometimes I would be gone 3 or 4 days a week. I worked in juvenile corrections in a very remote location. And I did that for a long time, and so I'd be gone sometimes for 3 or 4 days a week. And so at night I would get off and I would walk to the dorm that I stayed in when I worked there. And she and I, we developed this relationship around the moon. And what I mean by that is I would get to my room and then I would call her and we would get to this thing. And so we would talk about the fact that we were apart, but if we both looked at the moon at the same time, we were somehow connected. And so I would walk up, it was about 200 yards from the dorm, and I would walk up to where I stayed. And so I'd say, hey, did you look at the moon? Yeah, I looked at the moon. And, the moon is not always visible and stuff. And so we would talk about that. It's full, it's a crescent moon, it's a new moon, it's an old moon, it's a waxy moon, it's a blah, blah, blah. And we would talk, and we would laugh about that, and just, and I love you, And so then she does the reading this morning about the moon. And I'm sitting here, and I said, okay, And that brings me to my point today in terms of the idea of high spirituality. And so some years ago, I'm thinking it was 10 or 15 years ago, and we've got a couple of ministers here, you guys would know. there was some polling that was done, and you know, there's been polling that's been done probably for 100 years at least. It going all kinds of cultural and social and national polling and international polling, you know, where people are at, and people are out there asking questions. And about 10 or 15 years ago, for the first time, maybe longer, maybe 20, I don't know, for the first time ever, just as many people identified as being spiritual as religious, if not more. And what we know since then is that number has been growing, moving away from calling themselves religious and calling themselves spiritual. And so, this year is my 20th year of being a minister. And so, in the last 20 years, those of us who do this, we're ministers are wonky. You know, we get into the whole spiritual thing, and we keep an eye on things, and we think about things, and we talk about things, and we go to conferences, and we go to Zoom calls, and all this kind of stuff where things are talked about. And this has been rolling around for about 20 years of what does this really mean, and you know, what is this saying? What does it say to say that we are spiritual as opposed to religious? And so I think about it, and I know that I can't speak for other people, but I say, okay, is spirituality just a placeholder for religion? In other words, it just sounds better or something like that. Or is spirituality because I want my religion to not have guilt in it? Or do I want to have a religion that doesn't have a masculine God or something like that? You know? Or does spirituality kind of stand on its own? And so I think a lot about spirituality, and I've thought about it a lot lately because of a podcast I watched this recently that I'm going to share with you in just a moment. And so I was thinking about this idea of what I'm just talking about just now. I'm sitting here, and when I used to go speak, Judy and I had a ritual, and because she wouldn't come with me, and she had a lot of health issues over the last several years, and she wasn't coming with me, and so I would be heading out the door, and you know, I'd give her a kiss and something, and I'd say, you know, Judy, please treat for me, and she goes, it is done, and she would say to me, listen to the song of the whales. Okay. Now that story comes out of a dream that I had one time that I shared with her that became really powerful to us spiritually. But what that meant was get out of your head, because Judy, when I was at when I had the Paradise Center, I would speak every Sunday, and the hall there, or the main sanctuary, was a kind of a long room, chairs on both sides, and she sat right on the very back wall, right in the middle, and just had a straight shot at me because I was speaking on the floor with, you know, kind of a thing in front of me, and she was right there, and there's people around, and she would listen to me, and when I was getting too much in my head, she would just go like this, because I'm always flattered if people enjoy my speaking, but Judy was real. Judy would critique me, and she would talk to me, and we would maybe go have lunch afterwards, and what did you think and stuff. So in the last several years, I would call her after I would speak somewhere. Before I left, I'd say, can you treat for me? It's done. Don't worry about it. Listen to the song of the whale. And afterwards, I would call, because she's watching online somewhere. Maybe she is today. I don't know. She's watching on the cosmic line.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I said, okay, how'd I do? And she, you know, you're okay. You're too much in your head. And what she meant by that was, and this is where I'm taking this idea of religion and spirituality, and I'm sort of stepping in this direction, that Judy was one of those people who, she was involved in metaphysics and religious science and science of mind and Centers for Spiritual Living, and she was a big fan of Unity as well, because she felt spirituality intuitively. And she was a reader. She knocked down 2 or 3 books a week, but she always, you know, was most comfortable in coming right into my spirituality is right here and what's opening up to me, right? So Ernest Holmes says in a quote, it's interesting, I'm giving you a quote in terms of what I'm going to say next. Ernest Holmes says in a quote that I really love, there is a place where we begin and leave off physically, but there is no place where we begin and leave off spiritually. Now, I've read a lot of definitions about spirituality over the years, And I just found this quote of Holmes just recently. I mean, and this is why this has been on my mind, probably about a month and a half ago, because I'm equating it to a book that I just got. And I didn't remember this quote from his material that I've been familiar with for a long time. And I thought, of all these definitions of spirituality, I thought, oh my God, that's so amazing to me. So a few years ago, I was in Paradise. Well, it was many years ago now. I was in Paradise, probably only in about my second or third year of running the place, somewhere in there. And there was a gentleman who had attended our services, and he caught my attention. I mean, we were a small center, and so people were new and stuff. And I said hi to. I made sure I said hi to him, and he was somewhat familiar with. He was very familiar with metaphysics. He was sort of testing the waters for religious science and stuff like that. And so he said, will you be at the center tomorrow on Monday? And I said, yeah. I said, I always come in on Mondays. And he said, would you mind if I drop by your office and talk to you? I said, sure, that'd be great. And so he came in, and and he sat down, and we were talking, and he shared his background in metaphysics, and and he said yesterday, I really liked what you had to say, but I would like you to tell me about what you talked about yesterday and not use a single quote. And as a minister, I've got some quotes today, so don't worry. But as a minister, my training is that I always want to be able to ground what I'm saying to some of the master teachers, the books, the latest ideas, so that there's a grounding, a legitimacy to what the conversation is, what the direction is. And so I said, and I started to get in my spiel about that. I said, well, the reason I use quotes is so you don't think I'm winging it and stuff and all this kind of stuff. He goes, he said, if you're a minister, I'm assuming you have some training. I'm assuming you've read some books. I'm assuming you're grounded. I'm assuming that you're not too far out there, or else these people wouldn't have you here, right? And he said, so I want you to tell me what you talked about yesterday with no quotes. Mm-hmm. And so he began to push me into an area, and I said, okay. And the exercise was absolutely incredible because I had to come into my experience. And so, in other words, if I take Holmes' quote, and there's a place where I begin and leave off physically, but spiritually there's not. He's saying, Andy, I want you to reach out into the spiritual realm. That's amazing. Just like what happened here. And our as human beings, I think that our go-to sometimes, in terms of our shared consciousness, and when I say that, I'm talking about maybe our limited consciousness, our limited, Holmes used to call it race consciousness. I don't really like that term, so I talk about larger kind of unhealthy consciousness, or let's say limited consciousness. When we hear people say something like that, like, oh, suddenly, a dragonfly appeared to me, and and it just didn't seem to, I'm walking down the street, and it just didn't seem to let me alone, and it's going around me, and hey, Mr. Dragon, Miss Dragonfly, whoever, what's up, and really getting my attention. So then later I got into my spirit animal book, and I looked, and all of a sudden there's something there. It's like, oh my God, that's exactly what I'm going through. The dragonfly shows up. It's something like that, or a reading about the moon, right? And so our limited consciousness, oh, what a coincidence. Oh, that's really amazing. Well, it's dragonfly season, or, whatever. We want to do that. As opposed to this idea of simply letting it soak in and make some sort of statement to us that touches us in a place that's not here. And, in the last several years, there's been a lot of work around what we call heart wisdom, heart math. Buddhism has talked about the heart center for centuries, that place that is open to something larger. And I think that what brought me back to this is that in a podcast I heard this week, and I'm kind of I podcast kind of on the wild side. Anything on the metaphysical side of the tracks, I kind of, and you know how YouTube, YouTube knows how we're thinking, right? So it's chewed up. So I go home, YouTube, it all comes up, all the stuff, Buddhism, Hinduism, witchcraft, whatever, because I'm into it all, right? Authors and all that kind of stuff, because I want to get on the metaphysical side of the tracks. I want to get into the verbiage. I want to get into the thinking, right? And there was a gentleman there, and I'm not even sure what he really represented. And he said, the religious stories of antiquity are nice. They're comforting and meaningful. But what of the stories of our time, my place, and my experience? So as long as I'm on the topic of Judy, many, many years ago, Judy's father, Judy had 2 sisters, so her father had 3 daughters, and Judy was the middle child. Middle children, I'm telling you, they're the best, right? Okay, and so she was the middle child, and Bill, his name was Bill, and he and Judy were very close. And he struggled sometimes with his other daughters, especially when they became adults and, started their own lives and stuff. And there were some kind of feelings, disagreements about life in general and God knows what and everything else. But Judy was just, really accepted him. She loved him. She cared about him. And all the time she grew up, she was the one who, spent a lot of time with him. And he had gone through a couple of years of some really serious physical issues. And up there in Chico, Inlow Hospital, is the main place. He was in and out of Inlow all the time. He was in physical therapy. Judy's mom had passed away a few years earlier. He was not dealing with it very well in terms of taking care of himself and some other issues and lifelong issues, consciousness and ways of living in the world. So he'd come to a place in his life where he was really struggling. And so he went into Inlow, and he was under some really intensive, they were almost like putting him into a coma every once in a while and really treating him. And so everybody was coming together, and Judy was there just all the time. And so we spent an entire summer. We usually, Judy and I like to go to the coast and stuff, or whatever, go to the mountains. And we just stayed tight. She was at the hospital all the time, and she was still working, but she was over there all the time and meeting with doctors. And she goes, no, I'm just not going to go anywhere, and I want to see what's going to happen. And towards the end of summer, she decided, it was her decision, she goes, Andy, we just need to get out of here. Dad doesn't really know what's going on right now anyway, so I just want to get away. Let's you and I take a break. So we went to the coast, over to Mendocino and Fort Bragg, which that area is the reason this is important to what I'm saying, because Bill had been somebody, he was an outdoorsman, he was a hunter, he was a fisherman and stuff. And he loved to go to Fort Bragg once a year and do abalone, and then he'd come back once a year when the surf fishing were running, those little, I don't know what they are, but certain times of the year, and they come up right around dusk, and you see the guys throw the nets out there and get them, and those little tiny fish. He loved that stuff. And so anyway, that's a place that Judy and I love to go also. So we go over there, and this one morning I wake up, and Judy's gone. She's not there. It's pretty early in the morning. But, I figured she probably took off and, she's running around the beach or whatever. And so I was in there showering and stuff and getting ready. I look outside, the car's gone. And all of a sudden I'm just about dressed, and there's a knock on the door. And a woman, one of the managers of the motel, she came up and she had an envelope, and she goes, I think this is for Judy, an envelope, sealed envelope, little envelope. And I look at it. And I said, what is this? She goes, we heard from her sister. I said, okay. And it was sealed. And so, and this is before cell phones, obviously. So I'm sitting there, and I have this envelope, and I'm not gonna open it, because I honor Judy, and it's her business. And so, so she comes back. Anyway, I'm sitting there, and I'm kind of concerned, because I know what's going on back in Chico. So I'm sitting there, and there's a honk. I hear the horn honk. I open the door. She goes, in her arms, she goes, Andy, come on out. Let's go. Daylight's burning. Let's get going. And she was really happy and stuff. And I go out and get in the car, and she said she's taking off, and she wants to drive down to an overlook. And she said, she said, I've been out there this morning. I've been thinking about my dad. I've been thinking about, it's just so great to kind of be away from that, because now, I don't know, he's just really been on my mind. And, I was thinking about the abalone, and I was thinking about the surf fishing, and I was thinking about all that stuff. And, I'm just so glad that we can be here, because he can't be here. And she goes, I almost feel like he's been with me. It's really interesting. It was just so great, And I said, oh, that's cool, And then we're sitting there, and she looks at me. And she goes, what's going on here? Well, here's an envelope, So she opens it, and he had passed away that morning, about the time she woke up. And she read this, and she said, he was here. And she said, I believe that I needed to not be there so he could leave. Now, that doesn't fit within any religious construct. It doesn't fit on a whiteboard. It doesn't fit in a definition. It doesn't fit into collective consciousness or material consciousness, but it is a truth. When we open up to this idea of spirituality. So I want to share another definition of spirituality I found this last couple of weeks. And this is kind of a combination of a metaphysical definition, but also a social work definition. Because now I work in addiction counseling, and so I work on the edge of the social work world. And I don't know if you guys are aware of it. And I've been working with people for almost 40 years. That world is really beginning to open up to spirituality. I don't know if you're aware of it. Mm-hmm. In secular social work, it's becoming part of treatment planning and stuff. Mm-hmm. Spirituality. Mm-hmm. So this is a definition. Spirituality is an alchemy of emotion and feelings that are deeply connected and intertwined, as a capacity to observe and reflect upon deep meaning and purpose, and a discovery of a balance between a healthy sense of self, and something larger than one's limited self, through a profound sense of awareness.
Oh my God.
I love that.
Yes. That's amazing.
You know? About this idea that we are connected to something larger. And so, to put a finer point on it with Judy, so Judy has been struggling the last, since before the fire that burned down Paradise, because we lived in Paradise. She was starting to struggle, physically with a lot of issues. She went through when the fire went through there, I was in Chico that morning, I was already at work, and she was one of those people who was stuck in it, driving through it. Mm-hmm. In fact, one time we figured out she was probably one of the last cars that came out of a certain neighborhood that was even allowed to leave. And so she was driving through flames and everything else. And so she came out of that with a lot of PTSD. And so combine that with what she went through physically over time, combining the two, she found it very overwhelming. And Judy was someone who did her work, she did her metaphysical work, not so much, she didn't really like the medical world very much, but that was her business, right? And so, but anyway, she did her work. But eventually, I think that these are connected. This became her way of leaving the world. And so, so the night that she left this world very early, 4 o'clock in the morning on May 16th. And I had been with her in a room because a decision had been made probably about 6 hours earlier. And so by, say, 10 o'clock at night, 9 or 10 o'clock at night, she had been in an emergency room basically for almost 12 hours of people working on her. So it was decided that we needed to just allow her to be comfortable. And so we ended up on the 3rd floor of Inlow Hospital. And so I was with her the last, until 4 o'clock in the morning. I'd been with her actually since about 6 o'clock the day before, and then 4 o'clock in the morning. And so I'm there, and she was comfortable, and she was starting to leave. And so there was there was an RN and there was a charge nurse, and these two people are angels. I don't even know what their names are, and they are angels. They are freaking angels, and they were with me. I was there alone with her. They come in about once an hour, make sure everything's okay. And so they said, if you notice something different, come get us. And so all of a sudden, and I'd been talking to her, and and held her hand, and she was pushing her gown off, and I put it back on her, and she pushed it off some more, and I put it back on her. I think she just wanted to leave the way she came in the world. I'm not sure. But anyway, and so we talked, and I prayed with her and stuff. It was really wonderful. It was hard, but it was wonderful. So I noticed the change. So I went and got them, and so they stood there, and they were really listening, monitoring, stethoscopes, everything. They got it down, and they counted it down. And so finally, she left. And the charge nurse looked at the RN and said, would you please open that window back there? And so they went and opened the window. And I knew what that was about. I hadn't even thought about that. And I just looked at them. I said, thank you. And they said, of course. And the reason, I don't want to just talk about that in terms of parlor tricks. I want to talk about it in this way because there was something profound that shifted in me, because I believe that if we are open to the spiritual energies that are all around us constantly interacting with our consciousness, the consciousness around us, the micro us, the macro us, that part that Holmes says there is no end to. As we open up to that, what's the point? In other words, what are we getting? And so I left there, and I'm wandering around trying to find my car after it was all said and done and everything. And I sat down, and I knew that I was going to have family ask me, what do you think, Andy? What's up? And what came up for me was this: she's free. Mm-hmm. She had been housebound for about 4 or 5 years. I was doing a lot of caregiving and working and stuff. And she, she felt limited in a lot of ways. She struggled in a lot of ways. She also did find joy, and she did find peace, and she was always doing spiritual practice. But what came up for me, and everyone that talked to me over the next couple of days, they flood in, hey, what do you think? What's up? Blah, blah, blah. And, oh my God, what about Judy? And I said, she's free.
Yeah.
She's free. And it came from this idea of that window opening up so that her soul could leave. And as I walked to my car that night, and it was really a beautiful starlit night. The moon wasn't really out, but there was starlit night, and I imagined her flying into that vastness of stars, wherever the spirit world is. I don't know where it is, but it's there. And I just imagined her being free. And there was and believe me, I've gone through all kinds of grief the last year, and doing what we all do when we lose someone. But that sense of freedom has been so powerful to me, and it simply came from, hey, could you open that window? You see, that's what this is all about. You know what I'm saying? The gentleman of the podcast I was listening to, when I was listening to him, and he said that to me, this is what came up for me. What is my Garden of Gethsemane? What is my Bodhi tree? What is my walking on water? What is my experience of a mustard seed? What is my vision of Valhalla? What is my walking conversation with an ancestor? Because we can read about all that, but we have our own in our own time, because we are spiritual beings, period. And the great masters that we read about in all the religious literatures, and the great masters and the great minds, they were sharing with us their experience. And in metaphysics, what we believe is, they weren't saying, oh, by the way, I have these experiences, but sorry, you're not going to have them. No, they're saying, this is an example of what we all have. Because none of them were, none of them were saviors. They were examples. They were not exceptions. They're examples for us. Now, what I'm talking about cannot be drawn up on a whiteboard. It cannot be found in an equation. Maybe someday it will. Because let's go back to the moon. What we know is the moon has been seen as a sacred, powerful being for millennia. And it wasn't until relatively recent in history that we figured out it actually is very powerful in terms of everything that goes on this planet around our oceans. Our ancestors knew that. They knew it was powerful. They knew it was not just a rock in the sky. They had a relationship with it. That's what spirituality is. Someday the science will catch up to it. It's not there yet, but what do we do in the meantime? We open up to it. We live it. We feel it. We come into the energy of it. We come into the feelings of it. We come into the language of it. Anyway, thank you so much for having me here today.